Okay, Dr. Thalia Hale, I'm so glad to have you here today to teach us about naturopathic medicine. And I just loved our back and forth texts about random things that I always text you about. And this is the first time we've seen each other.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
And I love what you just said a minute ago. You were like, yeah, we're friends, but we've just never met.
No, this is how it goes in the 2020s.
Absolutely. So, you are a naturopathic doctor, and you have training that is just fascinating to me. Every time I talk to a naturopath, I'm fascinated by the tools and the insight and the really comprehensive, holistic way of looking at any condition. Can you tell me a little bit about your training and what made you go into naturopathic medicine?
Yeah, so I have a bit of a unique background. My mom is actually an information scientist. She worked for a pharmaceutical company in their library system. And so when I would get taken to work, I was immersed in Merck's manual, all the literature, all the journals. And I mean, what's a kid to do? There's only so much. You start like digging through books and like seeing what you find. And I found medicine really fascinating from a very early age. And simultaneously, like you, I have an Iranian background. So much of our home life was actually a lot of home remedies when we got sick. Like for us Persian people, and it's almost New Year, turnips are considered to be Persian penicillin. Like you got sick and there's like turnips in every soup. And, it's just,
I can smell it now.
yeah. So I mean, I think I had that juxtaposition of traditional medicine and research as well as home remedies and things that have been passed on through generations. And over the course of the years, my family started having experiences with conventional medicine. And I could tell you, as much as I want to be a doctor, I was disheartened by the approach and the connection between the doctor and the patient. And, as much as I want to be a doctor, that didn't resonate with me. And it wasn't until college where I started having some of my own health issues and was met with the same experience. And then I started looking at other things. And luckily, thankfully for my brother, he found a naturopathic doctor and suggested I take that route. And after my second visit, I was like, what do you do and how do I do this? Because it was a really beautiful marriage of how I grew up. So, that the rest was history. I found naturopathic medicine and basically took on like a pre-med approach and then went to medical school to study that. I didn't come to naturopathic medicine necessarily just for the tools as much as I love them. It was more so for understanding the person and understanding root cause as much as we can. And I think, we're always doing the best we can as integrative practitioners looking at it from that approach. But what I find is like I keep learning more and I realize there's like another layer to the onion and there's another layer to the onion. So I think we're always working towards that. But I really did appreciate the approach of looking at the whole person and thinking globally rather than system by system. I really did enjoy the aspect of like, wow, this actually, our gut is connected to our brain. This is connected to our joints, like it really is a remarkable miracle that we exist. Like our existence and how we come to be is an absolute miracle.
Like learning about the human body just inspires awe.
Mhm.
The fact that it works and you rarely have to take it into the shop to get it fixed, right? Like your heart ticks throughout your entire lifespan. Like how does that happen? And I think it was in college where I was like learning about molecular biology and genetics and going like, wow, there's like some kind of a higher power. Like I don't know what it is or what it's called, but I just see that there's something bigger than the ordinary that we experience every day.
And I agree with that. I think I've always been on a journey to understand more. And I started off with hormones and digestive issues as my primary focus, and then rolled in autoimmunity with those things. Then, I dug deeper and I started to realize I have some patients that have all sorts of different things going on. And that's what lended me to look at Lyme and then mold and mast cell activation syndrome. And then going into that space now, even I look at the boxes that my patients check, and a lot of times there's trauma. The trauma box is oftentimes checked. And so then we look at trauma and we look at how that dysregulates our immune system. And it's like a boundary, when we've had a trauma, it's like a boundary that's been taken down. And that to me is very symbolic of our immune system. And so when that's taken down, then we're susceptible to entities, whether they be physical or spiritual or whatever level we're looking at. So it's interesting is like, as I dig deeper, I do, like you, find that there is this bigger piece of the puzzle. And I think that oftentimes our physical symptoms are forcing us to go back into our body, as uncomfortable as it is, to be able to reflect on those pieces oftentimes, because if everything worked, you would breeze right through it and avoid it rather than have to go into it. So the healing oftentimes has to go in different orders or parallel in order to really feel complete.
Yeah. Give us some examples of what you think about when you have a patient with multiple sclerosis sitting in front of you. What are some of the different root causes and treatments? Can you maybe start with some of the foundational things?
Yeah, so the foundational things that I'm looking at is, and I'm looking at this across the board for different autoimmune diseases and or people walking the planet. But we're looking at diet, and I know with MS, there's been a lot of literature on different diets that could be helpful, but trying to have a more anti-inflammatory diet. And I think in this day and age, things that I'm looking at are things like electromagnetic frequencies, which are like our Wi-Fi and our cell phones. And the literature shows that it does increase oxidative stress. So when we look at it from that perspective, it's creating more free radicals, which means our body has to work harder to clear those factors and detoxify. So it just adds to the bucket a bit more. But with electromagnetic frequencies, we do see neurologic changes, sleep affected, different levels of sensitivity, even from like a very like general fatigue. Looking at sleep and quality of sleep, and looking at hormonal health, like the adrenals and stress and things like that. Those are some of the foundational pieces that I'd be looking at.
I don't think in Western medicine this ever comes up. Like all of what you just listed does not usually come up in a neurology appointment. Never are we going to talk about adrenal health and how sleep and stress affect our adrenal glands and our ability to keep up with stress, right? EMFs, forget it. It's like, oh, that's woo-woo science. We're not going to talk about it because there isn't a mountain of evidence. Let's just forget about it, right? But we know that these things happen sort of under the surface. So why not address them when we have easy ways of actually addressing them?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do, but I think that I believe, and this is a big statement, but I really do believe EMFs will be the cigarettes of our generation. And instead of addressing it and just being like, okay, we're going to create a law, no smoking within a building and no, smoking inside, and that's how we're going to remedy this. This is going to be a lot harder to remedy because our lives are entangled with these systems at this point. And I really think if we stopped at like high-speed Ethernet, we would have had the best of both worlds in terms of connectivity, as well as like safety of our bodies and safety of our cellular systems. So I think it is a really important topic that I don't think most people are addressing or want to address, because they're getting used to the comforts of, not having wires on their on their headphones.
Yep.
It's like we're getting used to a lot of those things, but in the grand scheme of things for me, like I'd rather have wired headphones. It's not that much of an inhibition to my life to do it that way.
But as technology moves forward and now I wanted to get a wired keyboard for my iMac, can't really buy one anymore. And I have wired earphones. I'm pretty sure those are going to get phased out too. So technology just forces us to change. I wanted to hardwire our internet, and you can't because the Google Nest thing won't work anymore. And other, your life just won't work because technology is taking us to a different place. And if you can't keep up, then things just aren't going to work for you.
Yeah. And I think it's hard. You really have to pump the brakes. I think for me and my own health journey, I looked into EMFs, and we were living in San Francisco. In San Francisco, you've got houses on top of each other. and really close proximity. And we had a beautiful view of the entire city. But when I brought the inspector in to test our house, we were having what they use for boats to know where they are in space. It's like some sort of radar, and I'm blanking on the name of it, but we were having that in our house from the sea because there is nothing stopping it from getting into our house. So it was picking it up in our guest bedroom. So we were just getting a lot of electromagnetic frequency stress at our home. And when I mitigated it, I really felt a lot better not having that in our space. And so luckily my husband is really well versed with homes, and so we hardwired our house, and it's made a tremendous difference to not have to worry about it so much. But yeah, he had to search high and low to find the ring that can be wired and not wireless. And, you know, like it is a tremendous search, but there are resources available in order to do those things. And yeah, you're not going to be talking to Alexa as much, and you're going to have to search things on your phone. But to me, it is really worth it for our cellular health and for our general health.
I mean, these are all human experiments where no one has had to prove that it's safe before they began the research, their experiment.
And when cell phones are tested, they're not tested here for safety. They're tested here for safety. And so they deem them safe here, but they don't do studies where they put it right up to your head. So again, I think this is really, you know, I don't know if it's exactly where we're planning on going. It never is, but I think it is really important for multiple sclerosis and brain health that we're not adding more oxidative stress to those areas.
Right. And what I appreciate about your practice is that you go to those really difficult places like mold and Lyme and mast cell activation syndrome. You know, these are things Western medicine doesn't want to deal with. They just don't, because they're complex to diagnose and the treatments are often complex. So can you kind of take us through some of your treatment protocols, or what you think about when you're considering a patient with MS and if mold is playing a role?
Yeah, so mold is first and foremost, and it is the most difficult conversation because you're looking at your environment, whether that be your work environment or your home environment. So it's another challenging conversation, but oftentimes those things need to be looked at in order for us to understand where we are. So typically what I'll do is I'll run inflammatory markers. I run complement 4A, TGF-beta1, and MMP9. That was developed or kind of coined by Dr. Richie Shoemaker, who is a pioneer in the mold arena. And although I don't do exactly how he does things, I use a lot of the elements of his knowledge in my approach to patients, but I do just generally look at what is the body's inflammation from that level. And most of my patients with MS have never had those markers as a part of their standard workup, so this would be new. And if those markers are elevated, that may lend to suggest a chronic inflammatory response in the body. And then another element that we can now look at it is from a urine perspective and sometimes blood, looking at mycotoxins. So actually looking at the downstream metabolites of mold coming through the urine. And there are studies that support, especially gliotoxin has been studied, which is a mold metabolite and toxin, to be correlated with inflammation in multiple sclerosis, as well as the demyelination process. So this ends up being a really important cornerstone. And I'd say it's always dependent on the patient, of course, and how they're presenting, but oftentimes that's a really important cornerstone, because if they're getting perpetual toxicity from the environment, it gets very challenging to support the immune system and treat any underlying infectious causes that may be identified as well. So there is a rhyme and reason, but we want to make sure the home space and the environment is as clean as possible for people to heal. And some people have old exposures that are still persisting and affecting them now, because some people can actually colonize some of these fungal issues, and then mycotoxins are still perpetually coming out. So even if someone's home is considered clean and good at the moment, it could be a past exposure that is still affecting their bodies.
Mold exposure is pretty common. Most homes in the US have mold in them, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so what are maybe just one or two simple things people can do to mitigate mold in their environment, in their
Yeah.
body?
So I learned this from my best friend and someone I deeply admire for her knowledge, but Dr. Jill Krista, Dr. Jill Krista told me at one point, because I was concerned about a spot in my house too, is to put in like those little humidity meters that you put in like a reptile tank, which you can get at Petco or off Amazon for like $8 or $9. And I started putting those in the corners of certain rooms so I could measure what the humidity was in that space. Because obviously, if you have more moisture, more humidity, you have more potential for growth of mold. And so you ideally want to have that humidity around 50 to 55%. So that's like a really easy thing of just checking to see where your moisture is in the house. And then there are some quick screenings for my patients. I'll recommend doing like an ERMI test, which is a dust sample test to see what mold spores are in the dust in someone's home. Now, that can be tainted, and there's different ways of interpreting that information. And an inspector would probably look at outdoor ERMIs as well as indoor ERMIs to compare the relative change. But it is a good spot test to see like, okay, what's in the house. But it can be affected by old dust and more recent dust. So there are particular ways you want to look at that.
Right. And how about just behaviors that we can change beyond just making changes in the home environment? What can we do from a lifestyle standpoint to make our bodies less hospitable to mold?
Yeah. So, I mean, that is a good question. I would say it's challenging to do if you're in the environment, but saunas, sweating helps with every toxin. You have to be careful with saunas because it drives out a lot of toxins. Sometimes that's too much for people, but even sweating in any way, movement, exercise, that helps us with all of our toxins, whether that be heavy metals or mycotoxins or other things. Sweating is a really important component of our lifestyle that can help move toxicity. And I think that is always what we're looking at, is we're looking at the bucket and how full the bucket is. So whatever we can do to empty the bucket, open up the exit doors, that is a really positive thing to move in the right direction.
Right. And I know there are people with MS who can't get into a level of exercise to sweat, and they're heat sensitive because of just how MS is. And I always tell people, if you can't do saunas and exercise, like that's okay. There's so many other tools, and hopefully we'll get to some other things here in a bit. Another condition that I'd love to talk about with you is mast cells and mast cell activation syndrome. That can often be a part of autoimmunity, where we have increased release of histamine throughout the body, and that can cause a lot of symptoms that are very uncomfortable. Can you talk about that connection?
Yeah, of course. So it's a bad joke, but I joke that you can look at mast cells wrong and they hyper react. So there are a lot of triggers that can trigger mast cell activation syndrome. Again, mold can be one of those triggers, but so can infections. Fungal infections are very common to do that. Parasites can do that. Viruses can do that. So again, like mast cells are a very important part of our immune system. But there are times when they get a little histamine release happy, especially in response to a lot of these immunologic triggers like infections and toxins. We see a lot of mast cells in the areas that our body connects with the outside world. So you'll see it in nasal passages, skin, gut, lungs, because those are our tissues that are experiencing the world and saying, is that friend or foe? And so similar to autoimmunity, we're having a friend and foe issue in terms of like what is normal response and what is abnormal response. So mast cell activation can ensue concurrently with a lot of autoimmune disease and or chronic complex issues. When you mention heat intolerance, actually heat intolerance and heat triggers is actually a very common trigger for mast cell activation as well. I have patients that can't tolerate a really hot shower or a lot of exercise that promotes a lot of heat. I oftentimes see that getting better once we start to do a lower histamine diet or address some of the triggers so that they can start to experience those things again at a greater comfort level. But that definitely is an overlapping component of those two conditions.
I have a lot of respect for histamine because it is a powerful molecule. I go into anaphylaxis when I eat certain nuts or, accidentally come in contact with minute amounts, like somebody ate a pistachio and kissed me, and then there I go. And oh my gosh, it feels so bad. There are times where I'm like, if I died right now, it would be less problematic than what I'm experiencing, because that anaphylactic like reaction is awful. And it's so funny. I think it's funny, but it's probably not funny, but I've gone into anaphylaxis running in the past. So I went saw an allergist who said I have exercise induced anaphylaxis. So I can actually say I'm allergic to exercise. So, but those are a little bit different mechanisms, but again, than maybe mast cell activation syndrome, but still it's this release of histamine that can cause, rashes and an asthma-like syndrome, difficulty breathing, swelling in the airways. So histamine is scary stuff.
And it's broader. I get patients that, again, you can call this adrenals, but they get lightheaded when they stand up. That's also part of histamine. Histamine plays a huge role in like vasoconstriction and vasodilation, which is like the blood vessels contracting and releasing. And so if they're mediating that, that's where you get like POTS syndrome or postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, where like the heart is beating really fast. So histamine can be involved with that. Some patients experience histamine as anxiety, headaches, joint pains, muscle pain. So again, like histamine really has profound multisystemic effects. It can have digestive effects as well. So urinary tract effects like frequency of urination and or pain with urination. And so there are, you could Venn diagram this thing out completely onto a lot of other conditions. But yeah, I think it's a really important piece of the puzzle to pay attention to, because that can really bring down a lot of inflammation and allow us to make better progress again in the other arenas of treatment of viruses and yeast and the rest of it. And then again, at that point, then you can start to see maybe the histamine reactions also come down once you're able to treat the underlying triggers.
Yeah. And there are some really reasonable approaches to treating histamine reactions, right? Like by choosing low histamine foods or using botanicals or nutraceuticals to stabilize mast cells so that there's less release. Did I get that right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll use all of it. I think, from the small studies that we've done in our office, we found that if you did the diet first, the stabilizers were more likely to work better. Because you're reducing the load and the bucket is low. So then you're just kind of doing some fine tuning work rather than trying to like combat all the histamine on a consistent basis with herbs or medications. But I think mast cell is a really challenging issue in conventional medicine as well. Most of my patients who have already been diagnosed with a histamine issue or a mast cell issue, really their options are just management. It's not, how can we heal this and actually make it go away? And I really do think, as hard as that can be, I think it is actually very possible to do that. I think it can be really quieted down and people can, heal that piece of it.
Yeah. And I love the story you tell about needing to do the lifestyle, the diet first, and then you put the nutraceuticals on top of that. And that's always my approach too. It's like, let's get as much as we can squeeze out of the lifestyle habits. And then the nutraceuticals are like the icing on the cake, right? And you'll just have more success rather than just trying to flood yourself with, supplements to try to take care of a problem.
Yeah, it gets you off the hamster wheel, and it's the harder approach, but you're more so looking at the long-term gains rather than the short-term gains. I think when you add in things prematurely, you'll get like an umph and you'll get like, oh, I think this worked. But what I find over time is it starts to wax and wane, where it's kind of like you lose the sparkly pony effect of like the new thing in your system, and your body kind of goes back to the way it was before. So sometimes we have to do those things, short term, but really understanding that we're really going for long-term gains, not necessarily a quick fix. Because at the point that we're at, autoimmunity or chronic complex diseases, like many of the things I work with, it's been a building process to get to that culmination anyway.
Yeah. like you said, it's complex and it just requires a lot of the pieces of the puzzle to be put together.
Yeah. And it's a full-time job. I have a lot of compassion for people going through this process because it's every day, it's like it's a concerted effort every single day and there's not always a vacation from it. So, putting the wheels in motion to feel better and have that positive effect really does help to keep the momentum going.
Yeah. A lot of patients go at this alone because this is not the kind of support you can get from conventional Western medicine. And so, they're always trying something new and it's so hard. And this is why I think working with a naturopath could be so valuable because you'll just make progress faster.
Mhm.
Right. That person can oversee your care and the different algorithms and pathways and just help focus you and without making you go crazy. Right. Yeah.
Mhm.
So how about ways we can strengthen our immune system? How do we use lifestyle and maybe natural products to help modulate or rebalance the immune system to help improve our MS symptoms?
Mhm. So I think when I think of that, I'm thinking of how do we reduce the body's stress? And I know we've already talked about some of these other pieces like opening up the exit doors and detoxing and things like that. I think when you look at it more holistically as well, even further, there are things like limbic system retraining, which is retraining the amygdala and working with the amygdala to find that parasympathetic nervous system and that vagal tone. Because there is a large body of evidence as well when we're in a more fight or flight state, in a more stress state, our immune system's function also goes down as well. So I think more so than boosting the immune system, we're really looking at immune modulating and modulating the immune system so it can have a healthy response, whatever that may be. So I think limbic system support, meditation, different things that keep you in a parasympathetic state really goes far. And then there's other things like, methylation support, like glutathione also helps with the immune system, and different types of magnesiums and different pieces that can really help to also support that process as well. But I think when I hear how do we help the immune system, I'm thinking stress modulation from a lifestyle perspective. And then there's additional tools like, with a doctor that you can explore, like low dose naltrexone or other things that really help to modulate the immune system. I found black cumin seed extract to be a really powerful one lately, which helps with histamines and immune modulation. And there's a series of other herbs that can also be utilized as well.
Yeah. Is it helpful to have black cumin seeds as food rather than as a supplement?
I don't think it hurts. I think sometimes we get more bang out of like when they really pull out the active ingredients. But I think, using a varied diet and having more variety in the diet is always something I encourage people to do.
Yeah. So there are so many things we can do throughout our regular day to day to help offload the immune system, right? And we don't have drugs for this. Like it's really just behavior, stress management, eating more anti-inflammatory foods, sleeping, right? Staying in that relaxation response that helps you go far. And I think we think of these things as soft medicine.
Mhm.
They're powerful medicines that actually get you far if you practice them every day. But I find like I have to, well, the patients that show up in my clinic already have buy-in, like they already know this is important. But I'm really interested in reaching people beyond that population or who don't have it on their radar, because these behaviors are as important as our disease modifying therapies. And it's not like you either do drugs or you do lifestyle. I think you do both. You let your neurologist decide what's the best for you on the medication side. And then it's never really an option not to do the lifestyle because it works every time. Doesn't it work every time?
Mhm. It does. And I think it works in different arenas. Like sometimes you don't get what you expected to get out of it. I had a patient who was struggling, not an MS patient, but just a patient struggling with like allergies and histamine issues and things like that. And we changed her diet. We reduced sugar tremendously. And yeah, her skin got better. But then she goes, my energy is so much better. Did you expect that? Like, are you surprised? I'm like, no, I'm not surprised. These are the side effects, like,
Side effects of a low sugar diet.
yeah, it's a side effect, it's like, it's not what we were, that we were focusing on, but these are the other things that just happen in suit. Better bowel movements, better other things happen, better sleep. So we get these side effects, and they're a little less scary than the other side effects. So even if your quality of life is better and you have that is an amazing stride.
And quality of life is so important. We're not going to cure MS, but there are things we can do so that we have less pain, anxiety, depression, fatigue, brain fog. Our MS symptoms improve. And I call that healing. I'm not calling it a cure. I'm calling it healing, because we brought our body closer to a space where our biochemistry can run better. Our DNA and epigenetics is working in our favor. The right genes are turning on because of the good signals we sent. And I love that naturopathic medicine has so many tools to help us send the right signals into our bodies. Something that also comes up a lot with MS is hormone health. Can you speak to that and how you, as a naturopathic doctor, think about hormones, balancing them, and allowing things to function in a more physiologic way?
Absolutely. So that's definitely something I do with all of my patients as well, is seeing where people are at. If you have normal hormones, it's great to know when you were normal, just in case something changes over a few years and you're like, oh, well, I don't really know what my baseline is. So that's worst case scenario. I think with most labs, I always like to have a baseline and see where healthy baseline is, and then we can watch over the years. Now, hormones, I'm typically looking at sex hormones, thyroid hormones, and adrenal hormones. And I look at them in different ways. Typically for sex hormones, which is our estradiol, our progesterone, our testosterone, DHEA, pregnenolone. I'm looking at those. Well, pregnenolone's more in the adrenal hormones pieces, but those hormones I'll look through blood. And then when I'm looking at the adrenals, I'll start with blood. So I will look at things like pregnenolone and DHEA. Because that gives me an idea of where cortisol is. And I will run a blood cortisol because it's available through traditional labs just to see where things are. But traditionally, when we're looking at the adrenal glands, which is our stress gland, I typically do like a saliva 4 times during the day to see what the curve is. Because typically with our adrenals, we want them to be higher in the morning to get us up, get us going. A really beautiful way of naturally supporting that is see the sun and get daylight as soon as you wake up in the morning. So it stimulates that cortisol production. Then we want to see it gradually fall through the course of the day into the evening so people can sleep. So that's why a 4-point cortisol saliva is a really nice test to look at that. Then we're also looking at thyroid hormones. And they all play in the sandbox together. So I'm always looking at balance between these 3 axes, the sex hormones, the adrenals, and thyroid hormones. And we're also with that looking at the brain and looking at the stimulation from the brain to these glandular systems in terms of which hormones they're producing. And that's really important because it impacts energy and sleep and recovery and just overall wellness feelings.
I mean, you just talked about that interconnected web of hormones, right? When we have a thyroid problem and we go to the endocrinologist, they run a TSH, a free T4, and then they may prescribe medications to replace thyroid hormone if it's necessary. There's no talk about how to support cortisol, how to optimize sex hormones, and giving, some information about how everything is connected and how you can support thyroid by supporting cortisol, right? Like these hormones don't interact with each other in isolation. They all work together. So I love this holistic approach of how you're not talking about hormones in isolation, but as a system.
Yeah, and they really are a system, and it's mind-boggling. Like you can put someone on thyroid, well, it's not mind-boggling once you understand the biochemistry, but you can put someone on thyroid hormone and they start menstruating, and you don't put those 2 pieces together if they are having difficulty with their periods. But it does impact it. Also looking at like anemia. Iron is really important to proper thyroid function. So if someone is anemic, it actually may suppress their thyroid function as well. So again, there's all these correlations between these pieces. And when I think of thyroid and adrenals, I think of it like a boxing ring. And it's a tag team approach. But when your body is boxing out stress, it's like, okay, tag in my adrenals to deal with the stress. Okay, my adrenals got tired. Okay, tag in my thyroid to help me create hormones to help me deal with the stress. So it is pretty incredible how they do all work together, and you have to look at them concurrently. And what I typically like to do is modulate one section at a time so I can see how the rest of the cascade goes. So I try and prioritize. Okay, seems like progesterone is low. Let's support that. Let's see how the rest of it shifts as a response. So I do try to be thoughtful about what order things go in and what priorities there are in the body.
Yeah. Yeah. So important to take the whole system into consideration. I think you just make more progress. And when I treat patients with thyroid, I'm always thinking about like, what nutrients does the thyroid need? Let's make sure, we're giving enough, there's enough iron and vitamin D and other building blocks, right? So I think it's an important approach, and not to say Western medicine approach is wrong. Like sometimes people need that thyroid replacement just to feel better, right? To have enough energy to get going. But like, I think we need to think bigger.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's talk about the gut. How important is that
everything comes down to the gut.
Everything.
All of our neurotransmitters, 80% of them are actually made in your digestive system. And, when we're looking at, again, when we get into infections, like our gut barrier is a really important barrier. This is where you probably may have heard of the term like leaky gut, where there's been enough inflammation in the gut that it starts to become permeable, and other things can go through the gut and into the bloodstream. And that can correlate a lot with what they call a leaky blood-brain barrier, because we also have a blood-brain barrier that makes it so certain larger molecules can't make it through to our brains. And when we have a leaky gut, it can predispose us to also a leaky blood-brain barrier. So again, that's where we always go back to the gut and focus on the gut, because, it takes in everything from food and different things. It brings it all in, and that can really affect the rest of our body.
Yeah. And ancient forms of medicine like Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, etc., all place the gut front and center as the foundation for good health or for bad health, right? So, and when I have a patient that's really complex and I don't really know where to start, oftentimes I just go to the gut and like, let's just work on that and see how much we can get out of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tremendous place to start. And I think I'm so happy to hear that we're looking at this more and more, but we're still learning a lot about the gut and the microbiome and what does that mean. And unfortunately, in our modern day society, we don't really have really good controls of what a healthy gut is, because we've been exposed to pesticides and glyphosate and different things that have really actually damaged our gut lining as a whole environmentally. So, we're really figuring it out, and we at this point have to go into really primal indigenous communities to try and find like what is a healthy gut. But at the same time, if we were to pop one of us into that lifestyle, our microbiome would be set for a tailspin, because it just hasn't been our regular environment. There's a lot that we are missing. So I think we're learning a lot in terms of gut microbiome and what composition really wants to be, so we can be healthier people. But our microbiome is so much of our brain, and so where there's more bugs than there is us. And so they really do dictate a lot of our immune system and a lot of our wellness.
It's such a foundational approach to health to get that microbiome healthy. And what makes me feel hopeful is that there are things we can do, like diet is one of the fastest way to shift that microbiome. There's studies that show that by changing your diet dramatically, like eating mostly plants, within a day and a half, you start seeing major favorable changes in the microbiome, where I'm like, yes, this is something that we can all do. And if you can keep it up, like think about how much progress you'll make. There's no other therapy in Western medicine, I think, that can give you that amount of progress that fast.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I think, I think I've looked at that same research and I think it's just fascinating. But I think also giving people the caveat that sometimes their microbiome has to adjust to them too. So sometimes when you go from like a very drastic diet change, in the beginning, sometimes your body has to get used to it because that microbiome shift hasn't really happened yet. So sometimes you kind of kick things up before they get settled down and get better. So, the first couple days can be a transition period that you have to be comfortable with. It's not just you change your diet and then everything, starts shifting in the right direction. That microbiome really does have to adjust to what you're doing.
Yeah, because it's like biological warfare, right, in your gut. So, and this is a good point to bring up now, to what you alluded to, is that I always like things to be gradual. Yes, in research, they've shown radical shifts with a radical change in diet, but we're not trying to do radical things in our real lives. Like, I always like slow and steady progress, slow changes, because that's how change happens. That's how habits get formed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And while we're talking about the gut, let's talk about infections.
Mm-hmm.
How do infections play into a diagnosis of MS, whether they're in the gut or elsewhere?
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really important part of MS and oftentimes a lot of autoimmune disease. When I think of autoimmune disease, I think of a to-do list that got too long. And I think we can all resonate with that. Like there's times when you've got a lot on your plate and you just can't keep all the balls in the air. You're like, oh my gosh, I went to the store, but I forgot this like major thing I actually needed. And then, like you are trying to hit deadlines, but you might be slightly off. That is what I think about even for our immune system, that if our immune system is trying to keep things in balance, but then after a while, it's like, oh, there's this virus. Oh, there's this, chemical in our system. Oh, it's really trying to cover a lot of bases and keep a lot of balls in the air. And sometimes infections can be a source of leading the immune system awry when it's trying to fight the infection, that it makes a mistake. And it's like, oh, that tissue looks kind of like that. And that's where that autoimmunity starts to ensue. So I think in peeling that onion back, we do have to look at infections. And again, when we talk about leaky gut and leaky blood-brain barriers, sometimes infections can actually cross from our body, our physical body, into our brain spaces as well and cause inflammation and or cellular changes to the body. So I think that's where infections come in. I know with MS, there's been for decades, people have talked about viral impacts. So chronic viruses, which, we're all exposed to viruses in our lifetime. And once we're exposed, we have that virus. It's our immune system's job to keep it in check. But when the immune system starts to go awry, it may not do that so well. So viruses is a common space that I'm looking at. And then there's other chronic infections that I'm looking at that could be tick-borne related or co-infections of tick-borne infections or from other vectors. So I think sometimes other vectors we don't think about can be lice, can be fleas, and they can carry certain infections that can also, carry pieces that throw our immune system awry as well.
Yeah. And there's been a lot of talk lately about EBV, and it's so tempting to start saying EBV causes MS because we want to really start like not locking down that information, right? But as this information is building, it's still it's a correlation, and we're finding out more and more EBV infections in adolescents seems to really raise the risk of MS. But we're still not at the point where we can call it a cause. And 95% of people are exposed to EBV. So it's ubiquitous. Like we all have been exposed at some point, almost all of us. And so, the approach maybe down the line is to vaccinate or give medications to prevent or to treat EBV infections long-term. But for now, what can we do if we have a mono diagnosis because we got EBV and we're worried about a reactivation of MS or the onset of MS? Is like, how do you deal with viruses and the immune system? What are things we can do?
So yeah, I think again, first identifying it. So a really good test for EBV to see if it's reactivated that I think goes missed oftentimes is like an early antigen test of Epstein-Barr virus. So it's not looking at have you been exposed, but it does give you more data points of like, is it something that's actually awake right now and maybe affecting your immune system? That's an easy test that can be covered under insurance. So I definitely look at that. And then in terms of supporting it, so typically in conventional medicine, when you have a virus, it's like go home, rest, sleep it off. And if you actually remember having mono, most people don't remember being exposed to mono. But if you remember having mono, people are in bed for months with fatigue. And it's just kind of like hang out, do your thing, and it'll go away eventually. But there are things that you can do supportively. There's herbs that can be helpful. A really potent antioxidant is glutathione, and glutathione makes enormous strides when it comes down to viruses. And typically I end up addressing most things with herbs and herbal supplementation and nutritional supplements. And then doing all of the self-care that you would do as if, you were fighting a virus, low sugar, don't fuel the bugs, and rest and appropriate movement.
Yeah.
But I'd say I probably hang my hat on my herbs and my nutrient support the most when it comes down to things like that.
Yeah. So new tools that we don't ordinarily dispense in Western medicine, but they exist within naturopathic practices, which
And there's really beautiful formulas. There's different herbal complexes, and for me, I have a few that I really like, but I do also try to customize that to the patient in terms of where they're at as well. So there's definitely a lot that can be done for viruses, even though conventional medicine, we've got acyclovir and valcyclovir, and those are typically used when someone has like a herpes outbreak, or, something else. But typically there are other herbs that we can use to support the immune system in fighting off viruses. And I find in a lot of my patients with autoimmune disease or chronic complex diseases that they are not managing their viruses very well. So I do try to get pieces in check for that, because viruses do impact the immune system quite a bit.
Yeah, for sure. So it's another piece of the puzzle that we should be paying attention to. And I want to talk more about what you call opening the exit doors. We talk about things that have gotten into the body that need to be excreted, or even if it's hormones or other things that are metabolites in the body. What are the different ways we could upregulate detoxification, both through the liver and through the gut microbiome and other systems, and also elimination, getting those things out of the body? What are some of the ways that you talk to patients about doing that?
So, I mean, I'd say one thing that is a chronic issue, I think, for many people is constipation. So making sure that constipation is appropriately addressed. So whether that is some sort of magnesium supplementation of some kind that keeps everything moving appropriately is really important, because otherwise, when it stays in the colon, it gets recirculated through the portal vein back to the liver to do it all over again. So you really want to be efficient with bowel movements and making sure that you're going every day at least.
This is so important. No matter what kind of patient I have in front of me, I'm like, do you have a bowel movement every day? And they're like, I'm here for anxiety. I'm like, I don't care. We're going to talk about your bowel movements.
Yeah. Yeah. It's important because, I mean, what is anxiety? It's pent up energy, So if you're not releasing and you're not releasing energy that way, it can definitely correlate with anxiety. But I think that's definitely first and foremost, is making sure somebody's moving. And then we're looking at liver support. So, castor oil packs are a really good naturopathic thing to do, where it's an oil. And typically what I do at night is take a nice warm shower to your body's tolerance. And then at the end, I just kind of rub some on, put an old t-shirt on, and then jump straight into the bed. And the heat does help with liver. And I put it over my upper right quadrant of my abdomen and massage it all in, and then, just hop into bed and let it do its work while I sleep. Some people do experience benefits from that. Dry skin brushing is another way of like stimulating blood flow and stimulating the lymphatic system to move. So I'd say lymph flow is really important.
And how do you do dry brushing? Do you want to explain how you?
Yeah. So typically you want to be going towards the heart. So you start like at the feet or at the hands, and you're just gently brushing towards the heart. You don't really want to do this. It's more of just like a brushing towards the heart gently, just to get some warmth to the skin. Because the thing is, the lymphatics don't move themselves. The blood vessels move the lymphatics. And
Mhm.
this is where movement is really helpful. So even if you're unable to get like a really good workout in, just a few minutes multiple times a day does help the muscles to contract and move the lymphatic system to assist in detox. There's also a really interesting unit called the Chi machine. So for my patients who can't move or are really limited, it's a device and you can put it on the bed and you put your ankles on it and it just kind of like gently jars you around a little bit. And that can really help with lymphatic flow when someone is unable to really get movement in. If they're
This
at
is
a
fascinating. I had never heard of that.
Yeah, it's like $350. It is an investment, but if someone's really struggling with movement, it is something that can help them move without them physically having to do it.
So for people that are wheelchair bound, limited mobility, or
Exactly.
even not, I bet it probably feels very relaxing too, to have that gentle
Mhm.
movement.
Yeah, and I find like vibration plates, can be a little too much for people when you stand and you're just like this all the way. So I think like the laying down and putting your ankles in and just letting it gently move your body, I think is a little gentler. It depends on the patient. Some patients really like those vibration plates as well to get things moving, but it just depends.
Great.
So those are a few examples. And then if possible, I really love Epsom salt baths, or Epsom salt foot soaks or things like that. You get the magnesium infusion, you get the sulfate infusion, which really does help with detoxification and liver function. And it's really calming on the muscles. And, it's a really nice self-care tool before bed too, is like doing that. So I'll do that. And then my castor oil pack and then jump into bed. Those are really nice tools for helping to get things out.
Yeah. So this is something that we don't really talk to patients about that detoxification and elimination, which is a key function in our body. I always joke, I go, even our hepatologists don't talk to patients about toxins, right? So these are wonderful tools. And I just love how naturopathic medicine is so broad and really leaves no stone unturned. Now, with every form of medicine, there's benefits and there's limitations. So I think we get the best of both worlds when we start mixing lifestyle with conventional medicine, with nutraceuticals and natural remedies that really work with our bodies to bring things into more balance. And it's really about creating this space of healing, right? Allowing your body to do that work of healing. If you're constantly under stress, eating processed artificial foods, exposed to EMFs, infections, all the things that you mentioned today, it's hard for your body to tend to those healing needs of the body. So thank you for this broad, powerful approach to MS using a naturopathic perspective. Tell me what it's like to work with a naturopath. How long does it take? Does insurance cover it? Do HSAs or FSAs help?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I do want to thank you for being such an advocate for naturopathic medicine. I think especially in California, we're still at a stage where things are very segmented, is like integrative medicines here and conventional medicines here, where I think there's models in other states that have really integrated pieces better, but I really do appreciate it. It's interesting, when I first started practicing, I thought I was coming to California. I was like, oh, it's going to be so easy to integrate with conventional practitioners and like really find that marriage. And it ended up being a little harder than I had hoped. So it's always wonderful to find doctors in other thought processes and other realms that are open to that integration process, because just like you said, it is the marriage of things. And
Yeah.
because we're all individuals, it's about us finding our tools to healing. And so we have to be able to try different things and have that open-mindedness in order to do that. And sometimes it takes the doctor's lead in having that open-mindedness to invite that approach in the first place. So thank you for that. In terms of working with a naturopathic doctor, you know, typically the initial visit is about an hour to an hour and a half. So it's a lot more time spent with your practitioner face to face. There are a series of different labs that we do. I think I do use specialty labs, and a lot of naturopathic doctors use what we call specialty labs, which are outside of our conventional labs. I do probably a 50-50, if not a little bit more conventional lab mediated, but every naturopathic doctor's practice is different in terms of how they approach it. And then follow-ups happen about every 6 weeks on average, typically, at least for my practice, because it gives the patient enough time to get some of those tools worked in, see how they work, and then we connect again. Insurance, unfortunately, at this stage of the game does not cover naturopathic medicine in the state of California. But you can take the super bill and submit it to insurance to put it towards the deductible or some other piece. And then typically labs, if someone has like a PPO insurance, labs are covered as an out-of-network provider. So you could get coverage in that arena. I would say for me, for my patients, I'm usually working with my patients for several years because, again, by the time they've come to my door, there's been a series of other doctors or other practitioners that have already chimed in. So I'm trying to like really do that comprehensive outside the box approach. But it is variable from patient to patient.
Yeah, it's a very in-depth approach, and it has to be personalized to the unique individual sitting in front of you. You are located in the Bay Area. Do you see patients on Zoom? And if they are outside of California?
Yes, so I do Zoom visits with patients. So I'm now, thanks to the pandemic, we figured out ways of making it work. And, I do see patients throughout California. I have my licenses also in Colorado and Arizona as well. So I see patients in those states as well. But those are the 3 primary states that I work within.
Great. And
Yeah.
how do people find you online?
So my website is probably the best way to find me, and that's www.drthalia.com, and that's DRTHALIA.
Perfect. And we'll put that in the notes so people can find you. Thank you so much for your time and for just laying out such a powerful approach. I feel smarter after talking to you. As you were talking, I was actually thinking, I want to go to naturopathic school to get extra tools, like integrative and functional medicine are close, but they're not exactly the same. And I want to learn about all the beautiful things that you've told us about. So thank you for the work that you do. You go to those difficult diagnoses like mold and Lyme, and it's such an important part of just making our immune systems healthy. Not that everybody has those problems, but it's something that it should be on our radars. So I look forward to having more conversations with you.
Me too. It's been such a joy to harbor this relationship with you. And I'm always happy to chat on the phone with you about more details and share with you what I can. Because like I said, that collaborative approach is just so much more fun than when we're all off on our own little islands doing our own thing. It's just not as integrative, and I don't think it's as helpful for the community in general. So thank you again for providing this venue for us to speak. And I know a lot of work goes into it, and also always being open to that conversation.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we are here because we want to be of service to others and to make sure people are aware of all the things they can be doing. And so it's wonderful having this connection. So thank you so much.
Thank you.